Sure. Thank you, Miguel. All right, so I have just a few slides, but thank you all for coming out on this cool, wet-ish night. So, yeah, as you know, our panel is about climate change, and we'll be talking amongst us about real solutions, of which there are, and false solutions that we need to be tracking and aware of and organizing to stop. Not only because some of the false solutions cause serious harm to ourselves, but because they really distract attention from what we need to be doing to avert climate change. Okay. So, I think I'll need Miguel's help with the slides, but thank you. Speaking of climate change, I think most of you are aware we're in a pretty precarious situation. There's increasing ferocity and frequency of hurricanes and wildfires, as we just had in our state, and disruption of normal weather patterns, including the disruption of seasonal rains that are really critical for farmers to be able to plan around and grow their food. We're living in, I guess one before, we're living in what some call decade zero, which means it's pretty much our last chance to avert catastrophic climate change. We are on the precipice. That's good. Thanks. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says we are on course for a 4 to 5 degree increase in global temperature over pre-industrial levels over the next 80 years, and that would translate into severe and permanent drought across much of the mid-latitude, food-growing areas, where the people who are least responsible for anthropogenic or human-caused climate change live. So it's an issue of climate justice as well. You may recall that 2 years ago in Paris, governments came together and signed an agreement, the Paris Accord or the Paris Agreement, to commit to keeping global temperatures from rising, keeping them below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Even at 2 degrees, because we are actually on course still for this much greater rise, but even if we were able to keep it to 2 degrees, the implications are very severe as well. We would see scientists expect that the Amazon River could dry up. We would see severe drought across much of the country, many of the countries that grow rice, wheat, and maize, with production dropping, plummeting. We'd see large areas of the Southern and Pacific Oceans as dead zones. So that's a problem. But this week in Bonn, we have the follow-on from Paris, the Intergovernmental, or the United Nations Conference on Climate Change is meeting. Unfortunately, none of the countries present are on track to meet their commitments made 2 years ago. So that's concerning. But even worse, as I'm sure you all are aware, our administration, the Trump administration, sent a delegation there to very directly declare that the US will be investing heavily in coal, gas, and nuclear as well. So really pushing us over the precipice. At least the other countries are moving forward on their own, and there's a contingent of US mayors and governors and some Congress people there who are, along with civil society, who are putting out the message that we're still in it. Next slide, great, thanks. So what does agriculture have to do with all of this? We know that agriculture is a major contributor to climate change, contributing up to 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that is largely due to industrial agricultural practices, as well as land use changes. So when we deforest the Amazon to make way for more intensive livestock production, or monocultural GMO soybean production in Brazil, or when we're clear-cutting forests in Indonesia to make way for oil palm plantations for agrofuels. So all of these practices together are contributing to 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, agriculture has the potential to be a powerful solution, and we'll be hearing more about this a little bit later this evening. What can we do right now at this moment? There are really 2 arenas for action, and one is we absolutely have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's no way around it. We can't, whatever solutions we come up with, we have to be reining that in, and that is reining in the some of these powerful industries that are responsible for it and holding our policymakers and our governments accountable. So reining in, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and on the positive solutions side, transforming our food and farming systems so that they are both more resilient in the face of climate change and all the environmental stresses that go along with that, and so that they're able to contribute by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that are embedded in the industrial production systems, like just the manufacture of chemical fertilizers is a big contributor. So reducing that, but also there are some of the agro-ecological methods that we'll be talking about a little later are able to capture and store carbon in the soil, and so that helps as well. But really we're looking at transforming the whole system so that we can have productive, resilient communities who are able to feed the world and contribute to mitigating climate change. So next. So the real solutions, and I'm just going to touch on this because Miguel Altieri is here to talk to us about agroecology, and that is what I'm putting forward as a solution that we have at hand and that has been in place, and that provides productivity, diversity, and resilience, as well as social equity. When you have farmers who are in the center of their farming system, making decisions for themselves, diversifying their agricultural practices, in these ways supporting ecosystem services. Really, agroecology is about integrating cutting-edge ecological science, principles, and processes with local and indigenous knowledge, and mimicking natural ecosystems and supporting, facilitating those processes rather than repressing them, which is the mode of industrial agricultural operations. So I'll leave it at that. I did just want to say that there's a lot of buzz these days about carbon sequestration and soil carbon sequestration that you may or may not have been hearing about. Sometimes it's called carbon farming. And this has the potential to draw down a significant amount of excess carbon from the atmosphere. Soil scientists who are doing these calculations estimate that the really most robust practices, agroecological practices, if done widely around the world, as well as some shifts in grassland management and rangeland management, can together potentially draw down over 350 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And that's quite a bit more than the 200 billion tons of excess carbon dioxide that are in the atmosphere, that climate scientists are pointed to as excess. Of course, if we keep putting it out there, no matter what we do in the soil, we won't be able to solve the problem. So I just keep emphasizing that we have to stop putting it out there. But in terms of what we can do, drawing it down and reducing some of that pressure, there is a lot of potential if done right. Soil carbon sequestration, maybe back to the farming, yeah, can, at its best, looks like multi-strata, highly diversified systems, agroforestry systems with deep-rooted perennial crops. Other solutions are silvopastoral systems with animals within an agroforestry, within these complex diversified systems. And these are actually what many traditional and peasant farming communities are already doing. These systems can sequester much more, like 10 to 40 times more than the annual cropping or livestock systems that we have also in place. But now the problem arises when policymakers and industry and even some NGOs, some environmental NGOs get so focused on the carbon piece of this that all they talk about is getting carbon in the ground. And getting carbon in the ground is, through agroecological practices, is a good thing. It's much more complicated than that because the carbon in agricultural soils doesn't always stay. It depends on what happens the next year and how farmers are working with the land. But what is really of concern to us is that there's this energy around, let's do this large scale. Like, forget about all these small farmers, the millions of farmers around the world who are doing these good practices. Let's have some big industrial practices where we'll call it carbon farming, and we'll get this carbon in the ground, and we'll set up markets, and we'll hear a little bit later about carbon markets and offsets and credits. But what this does is it builds a whole artificial market that then leads to land grabs, to forcing farmers off the land, because if a big company sees the big money behind getting carbon credits, they'll just be able to buy out and take over land push peasant farmers off it and have their monocultural systems that are really not the solution that we're looking for. So it's critical to keep our focus on the larger systems transformation that we need, and to really recognize the role that small farmers, peasant farmers, family farmers are already playing, and the real benefits that they are bringing to all of us through their stewardship. Okay. But here's the problem we're facing today, and you don't have to try to figure out all of this. You see concentration of power right there in the middle. We're still stuck in this conventional industrial approach to agriculture that is really about maximizing profit, extracting resources from the soil. And there are many reasons here why farmers and governments are trapped in this industrial model, but a lot of it has to do with the political and economic agendas of the most powerful actors on the global food stage, namely the big agribusinesses, the big corporations. Go to the next. We have seen an unprecedented consolidation of markets, of industry over the past decade in the seed sector, in the livestock, in the pesticide sector, in the grocery retail sector. And this slide by Phil Howard at Michigan State shows how over a period of years, we used to have like over 200 independent seed companies. And those are some of the smaller blue dots. Well, until recently, we had the big 6 pesticide companies that had very methodically been buying up the seed companies. So those you see, the Monsanto, DuPont, Syngenta, Dow, Bayer, BASF, those were what we would call the big 6 back in the day, like last year. But what is going on this year is even crazier with 3 mega mergers that are underway. Dow and DuPont. DuPont bought out Dow, so that has already taken place. Chinese pesticide company, ChemChina, has just acquired Syngenta. And you may have seen in the news, Monsanto and Bayer are in the process of merging. Bayer is in the process of a $66 billion deal to acquire Monsanto. It's still under review by the Department of Justice. It actually, the biggest roadblock right now has come from the European Union because it has to be approved there as well, Bayer being a German company. So for if these 3 mega mergers are all finalized, what we'll have is a situation in which just 3 corporate titans control over half of the world's global seed market, over 2/3 of the pesticide market, and the Bayer-Monsanto giant will become the biggest seed and chemical company in the world. And next. And this is what, a while back, Monsanto's Robert Fraley of Monsanto said, what you're seeing is not just a consolidation of seed companies, it's really a consolidation of the entire food chain. And he said that quite proudly, and that is, in fact, what's going on. So next, so what this consolidation of market power does is it translates directly into political power over our public agencies, over our elected officials, through campaign contributions, lobbying, through persistent political pressure, through the revolving door in which industry executives move in and out of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, or the U.S. Department of Ag, the USDA. We also see this corrosive effect on the science being done by our public agencies. So we see in the case of USDA, scientists who are coming up, who are producing, doing research and discovering the impacts, the harmful impacts of neonicotinoid pesticides on bees, on pollinators, being silenced within USDA, told not to publish. They'd have to get approval before they publish these findings. One in particular, being harassed out of the agency. EPA, again, if you've been following the news, you'll know that the very first thing that Trump's appointee, Scott Pruitt, to head the EPA, the first thing he did in office was to overturn a ban of Obama's Environmental Protection Agency, which was to ban a brain-harming chemical, chlorpyrifos. And that had been 10 years in the works. It was finally, EPA was like, yes, it's obvious we have to ban this. So that was the first thing he did. This chemical is especially harmful to kids' developing brains. Just back before the previous one, I just wanted to indicate, here is Trump signing the executive order for regulatory reform that he put out, surrounded by CEOs of various companies. The guy right to his right here, or in the left in the picture, is the CEO of Dow, Andrew Liveris, and what Trump said as he signed this, he handed his pen afterwards to, he said, "My friend Andrew, you know, Dow is doing great things for us. All these guys are doing great things." So that's the situation we face with market power and political power. All right, what I'm going to do next, it's not going to get better yet. that comes when Miguel takes the floor. I'm going to just give you a look into what's coming from industry, more of the false solutions. So next slide, thank you. And I should keep track of how I'm doing on time. All right, well, in the right-hand corner is more of the same. So what the pesticide biotech industry has been doing, especially since the failure of Roundup, is coming up with more herbicide-resistant crops. And these are basically designed, engineered to be used with chemical herbicides that the companies produce. It's really what we call a pesticide sales marketing strategy. And so with Roundup becoming no longer effective, with superweeds infesting 60 million acres of farmland around the country, now Dow has come up with 2,4-D resistant seeds, corn, cotton, and soybean. 2,4-D is well known to be linked to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and other neurological and reproductive harms. And Monsanto is coming up with what they're calling Extend seeds. These are engineered to be used with dicamba, a very powerful herbicide that has already been wreaking havoc around the country. It does so, it can severely damage most broadleaf plants, so anything that's not a grass, so fruits and vegetables, trees, plants that are not engineered for resistance. It volatilizes, it's very volatile, which means it will turn into a gas under warm conditions, and it can drift for miles. And so when the whole point is to have farmers spraying this, Monsanto's whole point is to have them spraying it throughout the growing season, well, that's when temperatures get warmer and warmer. And so it has already been across dozens of states, been traveling over 3.5 million acres of soybeans, conventional soybeans, have been damaged by this chemical. And we only know what's happening in the soybeans because weed scientists are tracking it. We don't know how much harm the dicamba, Monsanto's dicamba, has caused to other crops, let alone to people's health. So, and they're not being held accountable. EPA has just said, well, let's keep going with some more label restrictions, that is like restrict the way it's being used, but already the way it's being used is impossible to actually follow through and use it safely. It can't be kept on fields. Then we have things like gene editing and gene silencing, which is a new technology. There's a lot of excitement about the ability to snip out unwanted genes and plug in new ones. There's a technological approach called gene drive. The idea is to spread a modified gene through entire populations to wipe out entirely unwanted populations or species, like mosquitoes that are annoying. But we have no idea what would happen when we eliminate species from the ecosystem. And it's also not as fantastically precise as it's been claimed to be. Just this summer, Columbia and Stanford universities did some studies and found out that gene editing was introducing some unwanted mutations to an animal's genome. So there's all kinds of controversy about it. The fact is we really don't understand what happens when we silence or eliminate a gene. Genes act within an organism. There's multiple complex interacting effects. So this approach is totally unregulated, no idea what we're doing, but industry and molecular biologists are very excited and moving forward with it. Okay, then we have, before that, we've got big data. So in terms of the consolidation of the industry, Monsanto has already bought Climate Corps, which is a big data corporation. It bought Climate Corps 4 years ago in 2013. The idea being that these data companies using GPS or GIS, or geographical information systems, are able to gather massive amounts of data from farmers' fields at a very fine level, and then provide back, as in sell back, more data and instructions for what farmers should be doing on their land. So it's like big data, big brother, big, corporations. You'll hear, or we'll hear a lot about how this enables us to have precision ag and be very precise about what we're doing, but these systems really just generate more consolidation and larger agricultural farms or businesses. So we have to ask who's really benefiting. Is it farmers? Who really benefits from giant agribusiness and corporate-owned run farms? Is it farmers, family farmers, workers, consumers? I'm afraid not. So there's the big data move going, and then the next slide, that is a lead into geoengineering. This is the last piece of bad news I'm going to give to you. And much of what I have here, what I'm presenting, I've learned from ETC Group. So they're a fantastic organization that is always cutting edge on the front lines and telling us what is coming down. So geoengineering, intentional large-scale manipulation of the environment, particularly to counteract the undesired effects of other human activities like anthropogenic climate change. Next slide. There's a whole slew of technologies that are being developed by venture capitalists and fossil fuel industry allies, and with Gates funding and tons of money going into this. I won't get into all of them. I'm going to talk about two: solar radiation management, and that is basically technologies that aim to reflect sunlight back into space before it warms the Earth's climate. So it does nothing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's just trying to put up these shields, like space mirrors, or clearing forests in snowy areas so that the snow will reflect back. Too bad about the forests, I guess. Bubbles in the ocean and cloud brightening. So that I want to mention because next spring, I believe in the spring next year, there will be a completely ungoverned, unregulated, open field experiment in California at Moss Landing in Monterey County of cloud whitening. And so the idea is they're going to set up the nozzles on the shore, spray clouds with seawater. The idea is that it makes them whiter, and see if they do get whiter, and that is supposed to reflect back the sunlight and reduce solar radiation. And if it does work, then they're going to measure, were the clouds whiter? Did it reduce atmospheric temperature? And then they'll go from there. There's like people who talk about like having these cloud whitening devices out in the open sea, lots of them out all over the ocean. And of course, we have no idea what the impacts would be. There's another experiment coming up also next year in the US or outside Tucson, and that is called Stratospheric Controlled Perturbation Experiment, SCOPEX. And in this case, they're going to spray water into the stratosphere from a balloon 20 kilometers up, create a massive icy plume to study. And if that works, then the idea is to later replicate it by injecting sulfates into the atmosphere, up into the stratosphere, with plans to be doing this within like the next 4 years. So this is all in the works. We need to be paying attention, finding out. There have been similar experiments already that have taken place in China, Chile, and Korea. There were plans to be doing this already in the previous years, but there's been such an outcry whenever it has come up and been on the verge that we've been able to stop it. So stay tuned for information about how to block this. These are really high stakes risks because we have no way of knowing what blocking the sunlight, which is an essential resource for life on the planet, would do. Entire regions could experience increased heat and drought. And if it were started and then abandoned, the global temperatures would rise very rapidly. So it's no kind of long-term solution. There's ocean fertilization. I won't talk about that much, but it requires dumping tons of iron-rich dust into the ocean so that plankton grow massively, absorb carbon, and then sink to the bottom of the sea. No idea if this will work. Studies indicate it might not. It would create dead zones. It would very likely create dead zones. We see how this works already by removing oxygen from the water. Okay, the other one, next slide, another kind of geoengineering I want to mention here, and this is the last example, is bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. So this one, the other was about blocking sunlight. This one is about removing greenhouse gases, CO2. And we have seen already how beautiful, diverse agro-ecological systems capture carbon. Miguel will probably talk more about that in natural processes. This is industrial scale. This is talking about large-scale growing of biomass, probably tree plantations, quite possibly GMO trees, which would then be burned in an industrial process. And the resulting CO2 would be captured with chemical solvents that are then pumped into underground aquifers for long-term storage. if and when CO2, which can be lethal when concentrated, leaks, entire communities and ecosystems would be at risk from that immediate harm. It's extremely expensive, and it's not clear that it would even work. So far, it only exists on paper. But to accomplish what they're advertising as a solution to climate change, between 500 million and 6 billion hectares of land would have to be converted into this kind of industrial system. Currently, global crop production covers 1.5 billion hectares. So I don't know where the 6 billion hectares would come from. Even if it was 500 million, we're talking about opening the door wide to land and resource grabs that are already going on, exacerbating mass displacement of rural communities, disrupting food production. It's pretty insane, but it's real. And you can find more at etcgroup.org or geomonitoring.org. ETC Group makes a really important point. They say this is not only a global ecological hazard, but also a moral hazard, because it is giving governments an easy out by saying, oh, we can solve it, we'll do this, we'll solve it this way. And so diverting attention and resources from the true solutions like agroecology, ecological farming, that will give us much more robust solutions on in a whole number of arenas, as well as the work we need to be doing to reduce fossil fuel emissions, which these guys don't want to talk about. All right, so the last slide, and this is pretty much it for me. I just want to say that in closing, democracy matters. I've given you a whole lot of bad news, but you'll be hearing about organizing efforts from my colleagues on this. Ultimately, to really survive climate change, to adapt to and even mitigate climate change, we're going to be needing a pretty profound societal transformation at all levels, all of us working together. We're going to need vibrant, functioning democracies. We need community gatherings, town halls, and groups like this, people coming together, sharing information and ideas for organizing. We need to be really working towards a power shift, shifting power from the corporations that have none of our best interests at heart to the communities. And we really need to be listening to the frontline and directly impacted communities and taking direction from these communities, taking strategic direction, really listening. Like, they have the knowledge. We need to understand and listen to what those communities are telling us about how things need to be done differently. We need independent science. We need farmers to have secure access to clean air, water, seas, and land. We need racial justice in the food and farming system. We need to be restoring land to the native peoples from whom we've stolen it and other farmers of color. You know, there's so much racism in our food and farming system at so many levels that the technical solutions, even if we have some beautiful diversified systems, if we don't address that as well, we won't get there. But we can get there. And we need I would say we need an eco-feminist ethos to guide our relationship with each other and with the earth, and shift from a capitalist economy to a solidarity economy. These are pretty huge transformations, but what's at stake is pretty huge. I think that the behemoth, these big systems that we have been trapped in, they are falling apart. Like, all these mergers are a symptom of the desperation, actually. I mean, it looks like they're just having a big party, but it's out of desperation that these corporations are merging. We have the power of people, we have our creativity, we have our heart, and we have a lot of wisdom all around the world, so we can do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. I just want to remind you that after the presentations, we're going to have some time for questions and answers, and also to hear your feedback.